The typical home buying process starts with the home seller. The seller contacts a real estate brokerage firm. That brokerage firm meets with the seller to discuss the seller's expectations, and to write terms for a listing agreement. During this meeting things were outlined such as length of time of the agreement, the home's listing price and what concessions may be available to the buyer. It's also at this time the brokerage negotiates its fees for completing the sale of the property. In most cases they are also negotiating what fees they will offer to the home buyer's brokerage for their representation. These fees, referred to as broker compensation, become available upon the completion of the transaction as outlined in the listing agreement. The sale of a home is a retail business, just like any other business, and as such, the seller generally absorbs the cost of conducting business both directly and indirectly. In a real estate transaction it is important to make those costs transparent to all parties involved. Once an agreement has been established between the brokerage and the seller, the brokerage firm takes any relevant information for that property and customarily enters it into a data system used by the real estate industry across the nation. This system is most referred to as Multiple Listing Services, or the MLS. Some of that information is made available through public websites and apps. However, due to recent changes in MLS policies, some private information may only be available to a person who has representation by a licensed brokerage firm with access to the MLS, as well as limitations on what information can be entered into the MLS system for others to access. Just as with the seller and their brokerage, the buyer may be required to enter into an agreement to be represented by a brokerage firm. That agreement will clearly define the brokerage's responsibilities and also provides them with the necessary legal rights to negotiate on the buyer's behalf, and obtain information for them through the MLS. The terms of this agreement can be broad. It can range from 1 day to as many as 90. It may be for one property or for multiple zip codes. Most importantly, it also outlines the fees that the brokerage has negotiated with the buyer and how these fees will be paid. This can be a flat fee, a commission percentage based on the home purchase price, or both. These fees are required to be defined in this agreement prior to the initiation or investigation of any home purchase on the buyer's behalf. Once a buyer identifies a home through the cooperation of the brokerage or by public domain, they initiate the process of discovering practical information about the property, as well as information that affects the sale, such as liens or contingencies. The brokerage can receive most of that information through the system with the private access. However, things like seller's financials and buyer's brokerage compensation may not be displayed and unavailable. This requires the buyer's brokerage to utilize the buyer representation agreement to contact the selling brokerage on the buyer's behalf to obtain more information on the property, and to receive information on whether a buyer-broker compensation may be available, and if so, what those compensations are. This is important. The amount of compensation that is being offered by the seller, and any amount that can be negotiated by the buyer's brokerage, will be used to offset the fees that the buyer agreed to pay in the buyer representation agreement. In almost all but the rarest cases, those fees are available and are easily obtained from the seller, or the seller's brokerage, by the buyer's brokerage. In order to receive those fees, the buyer's brokerage will need to initiate a demand to the seller's brokerage for the fees in writing when presenting the offer. In the event the compensation by the seller does not cover the agreed-upon fees in the buyer agreement, the brokerage firm would have to pursue any difference in those fees directly from the buyer. In many cases the brokerage will absorb that loss as the cost of doing business and their ongoing commitment to the buyer and the home buying process. The buyer is, however, 100% responsible for paying those fees, and, in the instance a brokerage demands payment, per the buyer representation agreement, they will be liable. In all cases any fees must be made aware to the buyer in the buyer representation agreement prior to writing an offer to purchase any property. The fees would only be made payable in the event a transaction was completed as outlined in that buyer representation agreement. As is standard in most real estate agreements, the brokerage firms representing either side of the transaction would be responsible for any cost they incurred during the transaction process unless otherwise outlined in those respective agreements. Any attempt to recover those funds not otherwise outlined in prior agreements would require authorization by both parties to be recovered. Compensation fees that were outlined in any previous agreement can only become available after successfully completing the close of escrow. For more information on the buyer representation agreement, please call 209-910-5678 or visit www.arayarealty.com and select the buyer link from the drop-down menu.